This is everything you need to know about caffeine. Is it really true you shouldn't drink coffee first thing in the morning? Is there an ideal time to stop drinking coffee?
I think everybody knows that kind of person who has a cup of coffee before bed and supposedly sleeps great. Caffeine's having a negative impact on your sleep, regardless of whether or not you think it is or not.
And is your coffee habit hurting your health?
In the long term, if you enjoy coffee, just go and enjoy coffee. And the data in general suggests that actually caffeine or caffeine consumption overall is very beneficial for a number of different health outcomes.
Dr. Bryan Saunders is a caffeine expert armed with the latest research and science, and his lab specialises in caffeine's role in enhancing exercise performance.
Caffeine is a pretty effective supplement, if not the most effective supplement for enhancing exercise performance that's out there. You can improve muscle strength, muscle power, muscle endurance, so you can lift heavier loads and you can do more repetitions of that.
There's a lot of coffee fear and misinformation out there, so today we're clearing that up.
Is there evidence for this? Not really any that I know of.
I'm Dr. Karan, an NHS surgeon, and in this podcast we cut through the BS of modern health advice and tackle the biggest issues in science, health and medicine. Both coffee and tea are estimated to be the most consumed drinks worldwide, second only to water. But caffeine consumption is massively polarizing. Some people celebrate its health benefits, others demonize it and blame it for all sorts of poor health outcomes. So if you're someone that feels guilty about your morning coffee habit, or you're stressing about what time to drink your morning cuppa, you're hearing that you should have periods without caffeine, or you're wondering whether you need to stop completely, this one's for you. Dr. Bryan Saunders from the University of São Paulo is here to tell us the truth behind the online claims and what the scientific research actually says.
I've heard a couple of years back, about this whole thing about if you're consuming caffeine or coffee or any beverage which contains caffeine, you shouldn't have it first thing in the morning because you're not getting, the full bang for your buck because your cortisol is already elevated and caffeine is going to elevate your cortisol even more. And actually, it's better if you take it an hour and a half after you wake up, when it can boost you even more when your cortisol slightly dips, which sort of mechanistically, I thought it made sense. But recently there's more research which came out suggesting that's not even a thing. It doesn't really matter when you take your coffee, or that potentially caffeine acts on your adenosine system, which it does. And another reason why you shouldn't consume it in the morning. Is there any truth behind morning timing of caffeine at all?
Yeah, it's become quite big, hasn't it, this one? A lot of people sort of in my day-to-day have come up to me and asked about this, and you see a lot of promotion about it online. As you kind of briefly mentioned, I think sort of the one thing to take a step back is thinking about, how does caffeine actually work? So as you mentioned, caffeine has a structure similar to adenosine in our body, and adenosine rises throughout the day and has an important role in the sleep-wake cycle. So within our brain, it actually is quite inhibitory. So it kind of promotes sleepiness, suppresses arousal. So if we block adenosine from doing that role, we then can increase arousal, increase wakefulness and alertness. So essentially that's what caffeine can do in the body. So when it comes down to, should I drink caffeine? Should I drink my coffee, which contains caffeine, first thing in the morning? I've heard a few slightly different versions of why we supposedly should avoid this, which you touched upon. So essentially, when we wake, our circulating adenosine levels should be the lowest that they will be that day, because during sleep, adenosine is gradually cleared from the brain. But, if we have a poor night's sleep or don't get enough sleep, these levels might be higher than desirable. And so to block this, most people will then take caffeine, thinking, okay, this will properly start my day, properly wake my day. But the argument I've seen then is that this adenosine that's in your body then still kind of hangs around. And several hours later, when the caffeine levels in our system start to drop, then the adenosine that's hung around essentially can go back to doing its job, and we get an afternoon crash. Again, kind of supposedly. And so the theory is apparently to avoid this, we should wait for our cortisol levels to peak naturally so that cortisol can have some role in this clearance of that residual adenosine. Caffeine stimulates cortisol levels, and apparently the morning increase in cortisol levels due to caffeine ingestion is sort of undesirable, because then apparently it doesn't allow cortisol to do its job. So that's why people say wait 90 minutes to 120 minutes before consuming caffeine. It means that cortisol peaks naturally, can do its job clearing out adenosine, and you feel naturally alert. And then afterwards, you can kind of bump that up with caffeine. So I guess the question, like going back to the actual question you asked, is sort of, is there evidence for this? Not really any that I know of. I can't find any evidence even to kind of suggest that cortisol plays a role in adenosine clearance.
Yeah.
So I don't know why increasing this morning peak would interfere with cortisol performing that role if it did that role anyway. You know, it might be relevant. Adenosine levels are low when we immediately wake up. So maybe caffeine will have its least impact at that moment. But I would say there's certainly no data to suggest that caffeine interferes with this cortisol peak and how adenosine is processed, and that this all causes an afternoon crash. So the evidence is weak, or not even there, in my opinion.
So when you suggested that caffeine has a similar structure to adenosine and therefore can bind to the adenosine receptors, is caffeine bound to the adenosine receptors preferentially than adenosine, or are they both got the same affinity towards those receptors? So my main question here is, can caffeine work better to really get rid of that sleepiness in the morning when adenosine is still being cleared from the system after that night's sleep?
As for the specific affinity, I'm not entirely sure, something to check into. But what we do see in studies that actually measure the amount of adenosine or circulating adenosine is that when we provide an individual with caffeine, that adenosine in the circulation then rises, which suggests that it potentially even removes that adenosine that's bound to the receptor. So it certainly seems to get in the way. It is an antagonist of those receptors, and potentially even displaces adenosine that is already connected.
So is that a possible mechanism as to why people experience such a profound crash and tiredness after ingesting a lot of caffeine, when this caffeine bumps away the bound adenosine to its receptors, and eventually once the caffeine wears off, you suddenly get a flurry of all of that free adenosine now rebinding to their receptors and suddenly causing a massive surge in tiredness or lethargy?
Yeah, it's certainly a potential. Some people have suggested that it increases the sensitivity of these receptors to the adenosine that then connect once the caffeine sort of is metabolized, essentially. But again, I think it's far more of a personal thing rather than this is exactly what happens. I don't think that the scientific evidence is particularly strong to suggest that there's a bigger crash because of this. But certainly some people do seem to subjectively feel this, yeah.
Is there any, for example, there's some phenomenon when some people become habituated to drinking a certain amount of coffee, and progressively they need to increase the amount of coffee they drink to get the same effect. What drives that? Is there something which the body physiologically upregulates the amount of adenosine receptors to compensate for this caffeine blocking adenosine? What's going on that makes someone tolerant towards caffeine?
A lot of people subjectively do feel that the more they drink caffeine, the less they get that sort of buzz from it. And certainly in our lab, when we get people who are caffeine naive into the lab, we try to do double-blind studies where we don't know and they don't know what they're taking. But sometimes it's caffeine that they've taken that day, because the buzz, the change in their dynamic is clear to see. But it does seem to be less when an individual consumes caffeine, whether it be via coffee or teas, chronically. So it's difficult to say exactly what happens in humans because we don't have that data. But when we look at mouse models, which is a far easier model to look at, especially when considering we want to look at what happens in the brain, and we can literally take the brain out and look at what's going on. What we see is that in mice with regular caffeine consumption, their brains actually increase the number of adenosine receptors as a kind of compensatory mechanism. So that could diminish that kind of stimulatory effect over time, because essentially the same amount of caffeine won't bind to as many receptors. There'll be more receptors free for the adenosine to bind. And then again, that adenosine to have its kind of depressive inhibitory effects. I think a big caveat, again, would be, number one, this is in mice. Number two, this is with caffeine doses kind of 100 times that we use in humans, or usually consume in a coffee or a tea, etc. So we don't really know if the same is happening in humans, but you can extrapolate a little and suggest that this is maybe the mechanism that's happening.
So in terms of people drinking any sort of caffeine in the morning, or ingesting any sort of caffeine in the morning, is there a significant placebo effect at play, more than just the caffeine having these physiological effects, which obviously it does, but is there also a huge role for the placebo effect in making people feel more alert and more energized?
I think short answer, yes. I love this kind of placebo stuff, and our lab has some ongoing studies looking at this topic, maybe a bit more specific to the caffeine and looking at its influence on cognition and performance and the mechanisms behind it. But I think a lot of it overlaps. So there's more and more data coming out suggesting that there's a huge potential placebo effect of that morning coffee. And that might be linked to kind of the expectation of getting that caffeine and that caffeine hit, but also sort of that whole ritual behind drinking your coffee, your tea, or your drink of choice. When we look at maybe the expectation behind caffeine, when somebody believes that they're getting caffeine, but maybe they're actually just getting a placebo, we already see increased arousal, increased expectation. There's, in terms of sort of my main area of work, we can see that it can improve exercise performance. That's simply the expectation of, or believing that I've received caffeine, I'm going to get caffeine. You can already see changes in mood, changes in exercise performance. But there was a recent really interesting study that looked at taking caffeine as simply sort of a supplement, so I believe diluted in water, versus caffeine in a coffee. And so what they did, they used some sort of complex measurement techniques of the brain called resting state functional MRI. So a highly complex analysis of brain activity. But in this study, so they made several measures of brain activity before and shortly after either consuming just caffeine, so as a kind of supplement, or an actual coffee. And so they found that both caffeine and coffee did cause some changes in brain activity that were related to kind of a greater preparedness to switch from resting to working processes. So it suggests that the caffeine maybe made people more ready for action. But some changes in brain activity were only seen when coffee was consumed. And that, like, there was increased sort of connectivity in areas with implicated in visual processing, higher level cognitive functions such as working memory, goal-directed behavior. So it seems coffee produced a far more wide-ranging effect on cognitive activity, which suggests that actually the ritual of having a coffee may trigger kind of brain areas that's not only sort of due to the effects of caffeine, but maybe due to, the stimulatory effects, the sensory experience of having that coffee, maybe the smell, the taste, and anticipation. So really, really interesting data from this study.
Do you think the added benefits of consuming caffeine in the form of coffee, in addition to those ritualistic habits and that conditioned behavior, it's also maybe could be due to all the, the fermented beans, the coffee beans, the antioxidants, the polyphenols, and the sort of prebiotic fibers from that, adding to all of those cognitive and physical benefits?
Yeah, I think, and that's potentially a limitation of this study to extrapolate that it's entirely placebo effects here. I guess what they probably needed was decaffeinated coffee as another control to be able to potentially eliminate other compounds within coffee that maybe generated these effects. Even if it is these other compounds and maybe not sort of only placebo effects that are generating these changes in brain activity, it still does suggest that, maybe having that cup of coffee is more beneficial than somebody who prefers just to take a caffeine pill in the morning to get their buzz. Yeah.
So if someone were using some source of caffeine for boosting their exercise performance, what benefits can someone achieve beyond just increased alertness and focus when they're consuming caffeine to boost their exercise performance, whether they're a marathon runner or just lifting weights in the gym or cycling somewhere? What can they expect?
Well, in general, I think they can expect to probably improve their exercise performance. Yeah. The general consensus is certainly that caffeine is a pretty effective supplement, probably one of the, if not the most effective kind of supplement for enhancing exercise performance that's out there. And that, as you mentioned there, across a wide range of exercise types, that's the really kind of fantastic and interesting thing with caffeine. You see from the shortest duration activities, kind of those explosive high intensity sprints that maybe lasts up to 1 minute, 100-meter running, 200-meter running, 50-meter swimming, a cycling sprint at the end of a race. There's evidence that caffeine can improve performance. If you sort of prolong that exercise duration a bit more, a middle duration activity, 4 kilometers cycling, that might last anywhere from 4 to 8 minutes, if depending on if you're elite to a recreational. 2,000-meter rowing, sort of 6 to 9 minutes. Maybe longer endurance activities, 10 kilometers, 16, 40 kilometer cycling, time trial performance, cross-country skiing, marathon running. As you said, there's data to show that caffeine can improve this kind of activity. You've got resistance exercise. So, when you get in the gym and you're performing contractions of isolated or multiple muscle groups, there's evidence to show that you can improve muscle strength, muscle power, muscle endurance. So you can lift heavier loads and you can do more repetitions of that. And then even kind of team sports, which is a whole mix of, agility, repeated sprints and changes of direction. There's so much evidence to show that caffeine can also improve various aspects of performance during this kind of activity. So if you look at the entirety of the data, there's probably 300, 400 studies out there. In general, the average shows a pretty decent performance enhancing potential of caffeine. I think some people might think that a recreational runner, I'll take some caffeine and now all of a sudden I might be sort of chasing down Usain Bolt during that 100-meter. It's not a miracle worker. The effects that we see in these studies are generally kind of small to moderate. Okay. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter, especially if you're a competitive athlete. But I think it's certainly a caveat that I always like to mention to people. Yeah, these are small to moderate performance improvements. It's not a miracle worker.
Yeah, I guess it's going to optimize you as much as your threshold allows, given your current physical limitations. So if you're already an ultra level athlete, it's going to give you that extra 1-2%. If you're a casual runner, it will give you an extra 1-2%, but won't make you a professional. And really what I wanted to query was, how exactly does it exert these benefits? What's the mechanism underpinning these exercising boosting abilities of caffeine? Is it increased blood flow? Is it enhanced recovery, increased, glucose usage by muscles? What's going on?
Its effects on mood and on arousal, motivation is part of its influence for sure. So as we've already mentioned, by interfering with adenosine receptors. It can enhance mood and all these factors. But then essentially what we see is an increase in a lot of hormones that can lead to direct benefits on the muscle. So we see an increase in adrenaline, noradrenaline, that kind of fight or flight response that kind of leads to hyperarousal, and you see an increase in circulating glucose, cardiac output, blood flow to the working muscles, as you mentioned. So that's definitely sort of one method by which it works. There's also a large literature that we see that caffeine can decrease the perception of effort during exercise. So it feels easier. So that same, say, pace might feel easier, or you could kind of flip that and you could run faster for the same kind of perception of effort. And that's likely also due to the fact that there's adenosine receptors present in nerve endings that are involved in pain signal transduction.
Wow.
So if you antagonize these receptors, you could potentially reduce the signal of pain, reducing that perception of pain and effort during exercise, which I think is an important stimulus to how hard and how much effort an individual is putting in. And then there's also some suggestion that there are direct effects on muscle, that it can increase kind of the sensitivity of the muscle to calcium release, which is really important for muscle contraction. There's a bit of debate about how much caffeine is necessary for that, but it seems quite sort of all encompassing of a variety of potential mechanisms, which is probably why caffeine works kind of across the board for so many different exercise types.
So if someone was an average caffeine consumer, what sort of dose of caffeine would provide these increased benefits?
The literature suggests caffeine relative to your body mass. So most research out there has probably used doses between 3 and 6 milligrams per kilogram of body mass. Now, I always like to highlight to people it's milligrams and not grams. There's been some horrendous mistakes made. So for, say, a 70 kilo individual, that's about 210 milligrams of caffeine.
Wow.
And that already seems to be performance enhancing. It is a lot. It's, depending on the source of coffee or where you get it from, it's 2 to 3 espressos, essentially.
Wow. So, given that the kind of, I guess, safe limit in a day for a human is roughly around 400 milligrams, maybe. So, getting 200 milligrams upwards is good going for, a exercise boosting potential for caffeine.
Oh yeah. And again, if you look at those recommendations, they are quite wide. If you think about it, from doubling from 3 to 6 milligrams. So I would always recommend, as maybe a starting point, go for that lower end and kind of see if it works for you, see how you react, see if, if you're actually measuring your performance, if it's boosted your performance. Lower than 3 milligrams per kilo of body mass has been shown to be effective. So you could even go towards the lower end, maybe less of an effect. But certainly to go above 6 milligrams per kilo, you're then entering potentially trickier water, potentially some side effects. And the general data doesn't suggest that it's more beneficial, and actually might not be beneficial. So I'd kind of stick to the lower end of those ranges I just provided.
Is there an ideal time to ingest caffeine so it peaks in your bloodstream before the workout, say 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes before you work out to consume a certain dosage?
There's no good data to suggest we need to reach our peak, or that peak caffeine in the blood equals peak performance. But obviously, it does take about, depending on the ingestion type, maybe sort of 30 to 60 minutes for it to really enter the bloodstream and start taking effect. So yeah, if you're, going for a short workout, I would say, maybe an hour before your workout, ingest caffeine. If you're doing longer workouts, I mean, the washout, the half-life of caffeine, the time it takes to be metabolized and excreted is long. So if you're taking, say, that 3 milligrams per kilogram dose, in 5 hours, you're still going to have about half of what that peak in your blood was. So in general, I think timing isn't too much of an issue. But again, if your workout is short, if you're only going to do half an hour, 1 hour, maybe then make sure that you're taking the caffeine 1 hour before that. But those effects are then going to last for a few hours. And I think there's one study that shows even sort of 6 hours after ingestion, caffeine is still having performance enhancing effects. Yeah.
So assuming someone blow past the 400 milligram ceiling that's safe to consume for a human in a 24-hour period, presumably, you're going to have those really emphasized effects of caffeine that would have been okay at a physiological safe dose of increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, which is all exercise boosting. But they start to become negative influences, and you may get anxiety, increased sweating, palpitations, maybe even some GI side effects, some diarrhea or tummy upset. What other quite dangerous side effects can you come if you're really pushing that safe 24-hour dosage?
I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. Those are all potential side effects when we increase the dose of caffeine, aside from simply potentially toxic doses. Now, again, in general, we're not going to hit those toxic doses with, say, a cup of coffee or even like one little capsule of caffeine. But sometimes there's caffeine in, say, pre-workout supplements that people ingest, and they don't think about the amount of caffeine that's in there. They're looking to increase, I don't know, the amount of carbohydrate or creatine. And so they increase that dose, accidentally increasing the amount of caffeine, which then could lead to really quite high toxic doses of caffeine, which at the really high end could lead to death. And unfortunately, there are kind of case reports of this in the literature. It is rare, and it is really a lot of caffeine, that you would have to ingest sort of into the grams, into the several, 10 to 20 kind of grams of caffeine. But again, even going above 6 milligrams per kilo, you can increase, potential GI discomfort. You can increase anxiety. Anxiety is a big one. If you're a person who already potentially suffers from anxiety, is more prone to panic attacks, increasing, again, we've said it, kind of caffeine can increase adrenaline, noradrenaline. So that increases heart rate, blood pressure, symptoms that are similar to anxiety. And so that can exacerbate that anxiety. You're increasing cortisol, the stress hormone. So that can heighten feelings of stress and anxiety. And so that could potentially negate any potential benefits of taking that caffeine. So we certainly have to look to limit, look to take the minimal beneficial dose, in my opinion. Sometimes, more is generally not better. Go stick towards that lower end and see what happens.
I think a lot of people fail to appreciate that at the end of the day, caffeine is a potent drug, whether we like that word or not. It is a drug. And a lot of these leading energy drinks in the market, a full can may contain upward of 150, 160 milligrams of caffeine. And I know several people who chug through 3 or 4 of those a day. So they're regularly consuming more than the safe dose and not even really thinking about it. And then you wonder, they're feeling stressed, probably because of that, heightened fight or flight response and the cortisol and the adrenaline and all those effects of caffeine, which is consistently going beyond, a safe metabolic dose.
People don't realize the true potential. It's always that kind of, with many things, that kind of inverted U. Of course, in small little doses, it can be great. It can be fantastic. I love my cup of coffee in the morning. I love a cup of tea in the afternoon. I enjoy a bit of caffeine sometimes pre-workout. But once you start to sort of overdo it, hit the excess, that's when it can become too much, can become deleterious, and then it's no longer positive, it's negative, and it can cause all kinds of negative impacts, really.
So the stereotypical view of caffeine is that you take it and you feel alert and you feel focused, but paradoxically, there are a lot of people who take caffeine or any sort of coffee or anything like that, and they actually feel more tired. And this always struck me as quite strange. And I suspected maybe they are, genetically faster metabolizers of caffeine and they just chow through it. Their liver enzymes just chow through the caffeine a lot quicker. But apart from genetic variances in the liver enzymes metabolizing caffeine and reducing the half-life of it, is there any other mechanism as to why some people might paradoxically feel sleepy or tired after consuming caffeine?
Well, I think the caffeine metabolism stuff is quite interesting because although, yes, we have people who are faster metabolizers and slower metabolizers, the extent to which this actually modifies kind of perception of mood, perception of arousal, doesn't seem to link to that genetic makeup. So in collaboration with some colleagues at the University of Brasilia, we actually looked at, does an individual's genotype for caffeine metabolism link to how they in general respond to caffeine, a questionnaire-based assessment of whether they get the jitters, whether they feel anxious, whether they feel an upward lift in mood, etc. And there doesn't actually seem to be that strong a link between caffeine metabolism and genetics and how an individual actually perceives or feels following ingestion. And just on a side note as well, I think the data in terms of kind of caffeine metabolism and exercise performance following caffeine, it's a tenuous link at best at the minute. So I think we need certainly more data on the topic, but I wouldn't say that there's strong evidence to suggest that caffeine metabolism matters all that much. I think I might be proven wrong at the lower doses, but I think sometimes when, like I said, a 3 milligram per kilo dose is already so much that we're probably already saturating most things. And so metabolism of caffeine doesn't actually make that much of a difference. As to what's going on when somebody takes caffeine and actually feels sleepier, personally, I haven't sort of encountered too many of these individuals. I've certainly encountered individuals who don't perceive an effect. They take caffeine and they don't actually feel the effects. And I would say that's probably more to do with them likely being a habitual consumer. So what we do see with habitual consumption is that those physiological effects, again, likely or potentially due to an upregulation of the adenosine receptors in the brain, the physiological effects are reduced. So with kind of low level or lowish level habitual consumption, maybe up to about 200 milligrams per day, we can see a blunting in the cortisol response. Whereas sort of really higher end habitual consumption, kind of maybe above that 400 milligrams per day recommendation, that may even abolish that cortisol response after caffeine ingestion. Similarly, kind of adrenaline, noradrenaline response can be blunted in chronic caffeine users. So in those individuals, I think that would probably explain why they don't feel as much buzz as other people.
So those people who are habitual caffeine consumers and maybe they've experienced some blunted physiological response objectively and maybe even subjectively to themselves, they perceive that same dose of caffeine to have less of an effect. Is there any value in those people still consuming their same dose of caffeine to get any benefits? Will they get any benefits? Or should they undertake a period of, I don't know, caffeine fasting to almost reset their tolerance?
Our lab has been studying this. And so a few years ago, we came out with some research where we got people with different levels of habitual caffeine consumption, ranging from pretty caffeine naive all the way up to, in excess of the 400 milligrams per day. And we showed that caffeine provided acutely before exercise improved their exercise performance, regardless of, there was no association, there wasn't a blunting in those individuals with higher use. There wasn't a greater effect in those with lower use. So our data, and we have more data coming out, suggests that maybe your habitual caffeine intake doesn't matter that much in terms of benefits for exercise performance. But science is science, and you can find so many studies showing the opposite. And so pretty much at the same time as our study came out, another study did suggest a blunting in the effect. So this study was controlled in a different way. They got caffeine naive individuals, so with very low caffeine consumption. They provided caffeine prior to exercise and showed it improved performance. But then half the group went away and took caffeine every day for a month. So then when they came back, they were now kind of habitual or chronic caffeine users. And then when they were tested again, that caffeine prior to exercise was less efficient. It didn't eliminate the performance benefits of caffeine, but it was reduced. And so, that suggests that maybe chronic caffeine consumption does inhibit a little bit its effects. The key difference is maybe in the dose provided before exercise. So in the other group study, they provided 3 milligrams per kilogram of body mass daily, and then provided the same amount pre-exercise. Whereas the amount we gave to our participants was, on the whole, greater than their daily dose. So it was 6 milligrams per kilo that we provided. So maybe the key is, if you're an individual who, drinks, say, approximately 3 milligrams per kilo of caffeine per day, then maybe prior to exercise, you need a bit more than that to then truly get the benefits. Now, that's a little bit extrapolating the data. We're actually testing that right now in our lab. So hopefully that'll come out in the next few months. But, I think there is some logic to it.
I guess if you look at the literature, you'll see different numbers quoted for the half-life of caffeine. And I guess that will also vary depending on the individual as well. I guess maybe anything from 5 hours to 8 hours or anything in between. And although caffeine has various physiological benefits, it also has that negative effect on sleep and its interaction being an antagonist of the adenosine system as well, which helps us to sleep. Is there any way to clear caffeine faster if you'd consumed a large amount in the few hours leading up to your bedtime and you didn't want it to affect your sleep in the way that it mechanistically does?
So we've actually been trying to look into this to see if there is, say, a caffeine antagonist. But from our searches, I don't believe there is one. So the unfortunate thing for those who do want to take caffeine later in the day, or have taken more than they want and are having trouble sleeping, is that in general, you're just going to have to wait for lady time to do its job. But, I think the easiest way to avoid that is to just limit your afternoon intake of caffeine and kind of see what works with you. I think an important point when it comes to sleep, there's a really nice study showing differences in what we objectively perceive, or how we objectively perceive caffeine to influence our sleep versus what it objectively does. So in this study, they provided caffeine sort of 6, 3, and immediately before bedtime versus not providing caffeine. And when you ask somebody to objectively quantify sort of how quickly they fell asleep, how much they slept, total sleep time. Generally, they underestimate the effects or the negative effects that caffeine has had on their sleep. So generally, they underestimate or overestimate their total sleep time. They overestimate the percentage time they're actually asleep. So caffeine's having a negative impact on your sleep, kind of regardless of whether or not you think it is or not. I think everybody knows that kind of person who has a cup of coffee before bed and supposedly sleeps great. I'm one of those. But after reading this study, I thought, well, this actually suggests that despite my perception, it might not be the true case. There was a meta-analysis that came out last year, kind of pooling so many different studies that suggests that if we want to limit caffeine's effects on our sleep, we should look to avoid consuming kind of coffee about 9 hours prior to sleep. And at bigger doses, so those kind of pre-workout doses, the data suggests that we want to limit that to 13 hours before bed. So, if you're going to bed at 10, that's kind of limiting it to 9 a.m. in the morning. So,
wow.
Not that people are necessarily going to do this, but just people should be aware that it can interfere with your sleep. And so, the more you take in the afternoon, the more it can negatively impact upon your sleep.
How much value can you place on these trending things on social media where people talk about having a coffee nap, where they consume some coffee, then have a nap almost before the coffee really hits their system. And then as they wake up from their 45, 60-minute power nap, the coffee then hits and they're now less groggy after their nap, but they've also got the added benefit of the caffeine and the coffee peaking and they feel good. Is there any scientific underpinning as to coffee naps?
If you can immediately fall asleep following that coffee, then and have that, generally your nap should kind of be, I think, around 20 minutes, half an hour max. Then you would wake up at the moment that caffeine is kind of really starting to rise and having an effect. I think it's one of those that mechanistically, logistically, it seems to make sense, but until we actually test it, in my opinion, it's all just kind of hearsay. And it's all about like your first sort of question about should we take it immediately upon waking or 90 minutes to 120 minutes. There might sometimes be some rationale for doing this, but until we actually measure it properly in the lab, if somebody goes out and does it, then it's all just anecdotal. But it doesn't mean to say that if it works for you, then great. Then, I sometimes think that with science, sometimes we are too quick to dismiss a person's personal feelings. But, it is important that we say, oh, here is the data. On average, this is the direction. But of course, there can be some deviations from that direction depending on individuals.
Yeah, I guess, anecdotal data is still data. And if you get a series of anecdotal data points, it becomes a case series. So, guys, it's not straightforward just to wipe that off and disregard it. But what was interesting is that previously you mentioned that caffeine consumption can sensitize the adenosine receptors to be, more sensitive towards the effects of adenosine, and potentially there may be some upregulation of the adenosine receptors as well. Is there any long-term effect on the adenosine receptors when you habitually consume caffeine in the very long term, to the point where it actually could cause these longer-term physiological changes?
Again, I don't think we have that data. I don't think we know what it does, especially in humans, because it's pretty difficult to take a brain biopsy. So I don't think anybody's going to be volunteering for that anytime soon. Again, all you can do is look at what kind of long-term data suggests when we look at snippets of, people's long-term use. So, you can evaluate that via questionnaire and then look at their general health. And I think in general, the data do suggest that caffeine or caffeine consumption overall is very beneficial for a number of different health outcomes. We look at, there might be a minor reduction in exercise performance with habitual consumption, so we should really sort of remove it from the diet to avoid this. But it's such a minor thing when, in the long term, if you enjoy coffee, just go and enjoy coffee. And the data in general suggests that actually caffeine consumption and coffee intake in those, reasonable doses, again, as you mentioned before, 400 milligrams per day is kind of set as the upper limit or thereabouts, then you're likely to gain long-term benefits, and you're not likely to get any unfavorable issues, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think that some of the studies I read suggested up to 3 cups of coffee a day could actually, provide some significant benefits for gut health, cardiovascular health, even some liver protection and the antioxidant effect of, the chlorogenic acid and various things in coffee and coffee beans. I mean, Brazil and South America in general has some pretty great coffee. Is there any thing you'd recommend in terms of the preparation of coffee or the brewing or the even types of beans and locations and how they're harvested that has any effect as to really maximizing the caffeine dosage and how great it is for absorption, depending on where it's sourced, and how it's made?
Yeah, so obviously there are plenty of different kinds of or sources of caffeine. Obviously, coffee beans is one of the most well known, but then you've got cacao beans, you've got cola nuts from Africa, tea leaves, obviously generally at a lower amount, yerba mate, the guarana berry here in Brazil, which I believe can actually kind of in general per bean contains more caffeine than a coffee bean. So the different types of beans, the different locations or where they're grown, probably even one coffee bean to the next coffee bean right next to it, the amount of caffeine in there will likely differ. And then you've got to factor in the processing. Brazil, I agree, has some fantastic coffee, but it also has some pretty abysmal coffee, in my opinion. I've been to a really nice coffee farm here where they fully explain the process, and the most popular maybe because they're quite cheap brands or coffees out there are generally the less good beans that have kind of been filtered away and also contain a bit of dirt and a bit of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily want in there. And so they over roast them to make it a bit more flavorsome. But, you can kind of see it in the color. It's kind of more a black color, whereas coffee shouldn't really be that really dark black color. It should be a more light, muddy brown. And so that will already change or likely change the caffeine content. How much, we don't really know, but we do know that processing, preparation, if you do have a drip coffee, if you use a percolator, if you have a pressure espresso, this can all influence how much caffeine is actually in your coffee. But even trying to standardize that will still lead to different caffeine content. So there's some really nice studies showing that, again, the different preparation types lead to a different amount of caffeine using the same kind of pack of coffee. If you go to a coffee shop, you might think, that might be more standardized. But no, there's really nice data showing that the same coffee from the same popular brand coffee shop on consecutive days, the actual caffeine content ranged kind of between 250 and 550 milligrams within that one coffee. Like, obviously big coffee. Nespresso pods. There's a really nice study from Ben Desbrow's group in Australia where, you might think that they'll probably be able to standardize better the amount of caffeine in each of these pods. But no, they actually vary quite wildly from one pod to the next and don't exactly match up with what's actually written on the label. It's something I always mention to people who want to use caffeine for exercise performance. Can you use caffeine in coffee to improve performance? Of course you can. There's some nice studies that show that. But you don't know exactly how much caffeine you're getting. That's the issue. So if you're somebody who only wants a little, but on that one day you get a huge impact, you get that 550 milligrams, that might not be beneficial to you. Or it might be that you get the wheat coffee today and there's less caffeine. So if you want to know exactly how much caffeine you're getting, then maybe a supplement is the better option for you for your workout.
I think I heard, I hope this is correct, but it's the second most consumed drink in the world after water. And I think given that it's certainly very widely consumed by a lot of people, millions, billions of people around the world, most people don't really appreciate the nuance and the level of complexity as to what's going on in their systems consuming this quite potent drug. So thank you very much, Bryan, for adding all of this nuance and science to the world of coffee, which is incredibly important to people's everyday lives.
Thanks again to Dr. Bryan Saunders. Next episode, we meet exercise scientist Dr. Mike Israetel, who tells us just how little you can work out and still reap the benefits, the most effective way to lose weight, and why supplementing with creatine isn't just for bodybuilders, and much more. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and the weekly Dr. Karan Explores podcast, and I'll see you curious croutons next week.